James Mitchell stood at the tall iron gates of Oakwood Primary School, his small hands gripping the straps of his worn backpack. The September morning air was crisp and cool against his face. He took a deep breath and looked up at the old brick building that would be his new school. The windows seemed to stare down at him like curious eyes. His mother Helen had dropped him off early before rushing to her job at the village diner. She worked double shifts now, serving tea and sandwiches to locals and tourists. Every penny she earned went toward their small cottage rent and James's school supplies. Helen had dreams of a better life for both of them in this peaceful English village, far away from the crowded streets of London where they used to live. James was 12 years old with dark curly hair and warm brown eyes that sparkled when he smiled. His skin was olive-toned, a beautiful blend of his English mother and his late Italian father. Sometimes, when he looked in the mirror, he saw his father's gentle face looking back at him. His father had died in a car accident when James was only 8 years old. Since then, it had been just him and his mother, facing the world together. In London, some children at his old school had called him names because he looked different from them. They said he didn't belong in England because of his Italian features. Helen always hugged him tight when he came home upset and told him that being mixed was like having the best of two beautiful countries in his heart. She said it made him special, not strange. The school bell rang loudly, echoing across the playground. James watched as children of all ages rushed through the gates, chattering excitedly about their summer holidays. They all seemed to know exactly where they were going and who they would sit with. James felt very alone as he followed the crowd toward the main entrance. His new teacher, Mrs. Adams, was a kind woman with silver hair and gentle blue eyes. She welcomed James warmly and showed him to his desk near the window. During morning lessons, James tried his best to concentrate on mathematics and reading, but he kept noticing how the other students whispered to their friends and passed notes to each other. He didn't know anyone yet. When lunchtime arrived, James took his simple sandwich and apple to the cafeteria. The room was filled with the sound of children laughing and talking. Long tables stretched across the space, each one occupied by different groups of friends. James found an empty spot at the end of one table and unwrapped his cheese sandwich quietly. He watched the other children enjoying their meals together. Some had fancy lunch boxes with cartoon characters on them. Others shared crisps and sweets with their friends. James ate his sandwich slowly, trying to make it last longer so he wouldn't have to sit there with nothing to do. 3 older boys at a nearby table noticed James sitting alone. Tony Clark was the tallest of the group, with blonde hair and sharp blue eyes. He was 13 and already known around school as someone who liked to be in charge. His friends Ben and David always followed him round, laughing at his jokes and copying what he did. Tommy nudged his friends and pointed toward James. "Look what we have here," he said with a mean smile. "New boy thinks he's too good to talk to anyone." The 3 boys stood up and walked over to James's table. James looked up from his sandwich, his heart starting to beat faster. He could tell from their faces that they weren't coming over to be friendly. "I'm just eating my lunch," James said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, then crossed his arms and stared down at James. "Where are you from then? You don't look like you belong here in our village." James felt his cheeks grow hot with embarrassment. The other children at nearby tables had stopped talking and were watching what was happening. James wanted to explain that he was just as English as they were, that his mother was born in Yorkshire, that he had every right to be there, but the words stuck in his throat like thick honey. Tommy laughed loudly. "Cat got your tongue. Maybe you should go back to where you came from." David joined in the laughter. "Yeah, "We don't need any foreigners here." James felt tears starting to form in his eyes, but he blinked them back quickly. He didn't want to cry in front of everyone. Instead, he carefully wrapped up the rest of his sandwich and put it back in his lunch bag. His hands were shaking slightly as he stood up from the table. The three boys continued to snicker as James walked away. He could hear them making jokes about his appearance and his clothes. Other children stared at him as he passed their tables, some looking sorry for him, others just curious about the drama. James spent the rest of lunch break sitting alone in the library, pretending to read a book about dinosaurs. The words on the page blurred together as he thought about what had just happened that evening. James sat on his bed in their small cottage bedroom. On his bedside table was a framed photograph of his father, taken just a few months before the accident. His father was smiling widely, his arm round James at a fun fair in London. "I wish you were here, Dad," James whispered to the photograph. "You would know what to do." He could hear his mother moving round in the kitchen downstairs, preparing their simple dinner after her long day at work. James didn't want to tell her about the bullying. She was already working so hard to give them both a better life. Use a warm, empathetic dinner. The weeks that followed James's first day at Oakwood Primary School grew darker and more difficult. Tony Clark and his two friends, Ben and David, seemed to find new ways to make James's life miserable every single day. What had started as mean words in the cafeteria had grown into something much worse. Every morning when James walked through the school corridors, he kept his head down and tried to move quickly to his classroom. But Tony and his gang always seemed to know where to find him. They would wait round corners like hungry cats waiting for a mouse. When James carried his books and papers from one class to another, Tommy would bump into him on purpose, sending everything flying across the floor. "Oops, sorry," Tommy would say with a fake smile while James scrambled to pick up his scattered homework and textbooks. The other students would walk round the mess, some stepping on James's papers without even looking down. During break time, the three bullies would follow James round the playground. They made fun of his second-hand school jumper that had small holes near the sleeves. They laughed at his shoes that were clean but clearly old and worn. James's mother had bought them from a charity shop because new shoes were too expensive. "Look at the poor boy's clothes," Ben would whisper loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Doesn't his mummy have enough money to buy him proper things?" David would join in, pointing at James's school bag that Helen had carefully repaired with patches where the fabric had torn. "Maybe he found that bag in the rubbish bin," he would say, making the other children giggle. Physical education class became James's least favorite time of the week, when the teacher, Mr. Roberts, told the students to pick teams for football or cricket. Tommy and his friends would make sure James was always chosen last. Sometimes they would deliberately not choose him at all, leaving him to stand alone while Mr. Roberts had to assign him to a team. During the games, if James tried to participate, the other boys would refuse to pass him the ball. When he ran to get into position, they would block his path or pretend not to see him. If James ever managed to touch the ball, Tommy would shout things like, "Don't let the outsider ruin our game." James tried his hardest to focus on his schoolwork. Mathematics had always been his favorite subject, and reading came naturally to him. But as the bullying continued day after day, he found it harder and harder to concentrate on his lessons. When Mrs. Adams was explaining fractions on the blackboard, James would be thinking about where Tommy and his friends might be waiting for him next, or his homework grades began to drop from A's to B's, and then to C's. James would sit at his small desk in his bedroom, staring at his worksheets, but the numbers and letters would blur together. His mind was too full of worry and sadness to focus properly on his studies. Mrs. Adams was a wise woman who had been teaching children for over 30 years. She had seen many students struggle with different problems, and she knew the signs of a child who was being hurt by others. She noticed how James had stopped raising his hand to answer questions in class. She saw how he would flinch when other children walked past his desk. Most importantly, she noticed the sadness that seemed to live permanently in his young eyes. One Thursday afternoon, after the other students had gone home, Mrs. Adams asked James to stay behind for a few minutes. She sat down in the chair next to his desk instead of standing at the front of the classroom like a teacher. This made James feel less nervous. "James," she said gently, "is everything all right at home? You seem very unhappy lately, and your work isn't as good as it was when you first arrived." James looked down at his hands and nodded his head quickly. "Yes, miss, everything's fine at home." But Mrs. Adams could see right through his polite lie. She had watched enough children over the years to recognize when someone was trying to hide their pain. The way James's shoulders were always hunched forward, as if he was trying to make himself smaller. The way he ate his lunch as quickly as possible and then disappeared to the library. The way he walked through the corridors with his eyes fixed on the floor. The breaking point came on a particularly wet and windy Tuesday afternoon. The autumn rain was falling heavily, creating deep puddles all around the school playground. Most of the children were staying inside during their lunch break, playing board games or reading in the warm classrooms. James had finished eating his sandwich and was walking carefully across the slippery playground to reach the library where he felt safe. The rain had soaked through his thin jacket, and he was looking forward to sitting quietly with a book until lessons started again. Tommy, Ben, and David had been watching him from inside the school building. They saw James walking alone across the empty playground and decided it was the perfect opportunity for their meanest trick yet. The three boys ran outside into the rain and surrounded James near the biggest puddle in the playground. Before James could understand what was happening, Tommy placed both hands on James's chest and gave him a hard push backward. James lost his balance and fell straight into the cold, muddy water. His school uniform was instantly soaked through, and thick brown mud covered his shirt, trousers, and shoes. The dirty water was so cold it took his breath away. Tommy and his friends stood over James, laughing loudly at their cruel prank. Some other children had seen what happened through the windows and came outside to look. A few of them laughed along with the bullies, but many others looked shocked and uncomfortable. They knew what they had just witnessed was wrong. James struggled to get out of the muddy puddle, his clothes heavy with water and dirt. He felt more embarrassed and hurt than he had ever felt in his entire life. This time, he couldn't hold back his tears. That evening, when James walked through the front door of their small cottage, Helen immediately saw his ruined uniform and the defeated look on his son's face. She had been preparing their dinner after another long day at the diner, but she dropped everything and knelt down to James's level. "James, what happened to your uniform?" she asked gently, her voice full of concern. For the first time since the bullying had started, James couldn't keep his feelings inside anymore. His eyes filled with tears and his voice shook as he spoke. "Some boys at school, they don't like me, Mom. They say I don't belong here. They push me and call me names every day. Today, they pushed me into a puddle and everyone laughed at me." Helen felt her heart break as she pulled her son into the warmest, tightest hug she could give. She held him close while he cried, feeling angry at the children who were hurting her precious boy, but also proud of him for finally telling the truth. "Oh, my sweet boy," she whispered into his hair, You belong wherever your kind heart takes you. But I think it's time we called your grandfather." James pulled back from the hug and looked at his mother with confusion. Helen rarely talked about Vincent Romano, his father's father, who lived far away in Manchester. "Why, Mum?" James asked Helen, smiled softly and wiped the tears from her son's cheeks. "Because sometimes we need family to remind us who we really are." Use a warm, empathetic tone-Saturday morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the small windows of the cottage. James woke up to the sound of a car engine puttering outside their home. He looked through his bedroom window and saw an old dark blue car parked carefully next to their garden gate. The car was probably 20 years old, but it gleamed like it had been washed and polished with great care. A tall man stepped out of the driver's seat and stretched his back after the long drive from Manchester. Vincent Romano was in his 70s, but he moved with the steady confidence of someone much younger. His silver hair was combed neatly back, and his kind eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen many different seasons of life. He wore a simple grey sweater and dark trousers, clothes that were clean and well kept, but not fancy. James had only met his grandfather 3 or 4 times in his whole life. The Romano family had lived far away in Manchester, and after James's father died, the visits had become even less frequent. But James remembered Vincent's gentle voice and the way his grandfather always shook hands firmly, looking directly into people's eyes when he spoke to them. Helen opened the front door before Vincent could knock. She had been watching from the kitchen window, nervous about asking her father-in-law for help, but knowing that James needed someone who could understand what he was going through. "Hello, Vincent," Helen said softly. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Vincent gave her a warm hug. "Of course, Helen. Family helps family. That's how it's always been." James appeared in the doorway, still wearing his pajamas and feeling shy about seeing his grandfather after such a long time. Vincent's face lit up with a genuine smile when he saw his grandson. "Hello, James," Vincent said, opening his arms wide. "Your mother tells me you're having some trouble at school." James walked into his grandfather's embrace, surprised by how safe and protected he felt in those strong arms. Vincent smelled like soap and aftershave, and his hug was firm but gentle after James got dressed. Vincent suggested they sit together in the small garden behind the cottage. Helen had planted roses and daffodils round the edges, and there was a wooden bench where they could talk privately. The morning air was crisp and fresh, and birds were singing in the old oak tree that grew at the back of their property. James sat next to his grandfather on the bench, his hands folded in his lap. He felt nervous about telling the whole story, but Vincent waited patiently without rushing him. "Tell me what's been happening at school," Vincent said quietly. "Take your time. I'm here to listen." So James began to explain everything. He told his grandfather about Tommy, Ben, and David. He described how they called him names and made fun of his clothes. He explained how they knocked his books down in the hallways and excluded him from games during sports class. He talked about feeling alone every day and how hard it had become to concentrate on his schoolwork. Vincent listened carefully to every word. He didn't interrupt or tell James that things weren't so bad. He didn't say that boys will be boys, or that this was just part of growing up. He simply listened with his full attention, nodding occasionally to show that he understood. When James finished talking, he felt like a heavy weight had been lifted from his chest. He had never told the complete story to anyone before, and it felt good to have someone truly hear him. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, looking thoughtfully at the roses in Helen's garden. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and steady. "You know, James, when I was young, I lived in a very tough neighborhood in Manchester. The streets were rough, and there were bullies there too. But these weren't children like the ones bothering you at school. These were grown men who thought they could push round anyone who was smaller or different from them. James looked up at his grandfather with new interest. He had never heard stories about Vincent's childhood before. "What did you do, Grandpa?" James asked. Vincent smiled and put his arm round his grandson's shoulders. "Well, I learned something very important. During those difficult years, real strength isn't about being the biggest person in the room or the loudest person in the crowd. Real strength is about standing up for what's right. Especially when you're helping people who can't stand up for themselves." Over the next hour, Vincent told James amazing stories about his life in Manchester. He explained how he had helped protect small shopkeepers when troublemakers tried to steal from them or damage their stores. He described how he had organized all the neighbors on his street to look after the elderly people who lived alone, making sure they had enough food and heat during the cold winter months. Vincent talked about times when he had stepped in to help children who were being pecked on by older kids or adults. He had used his reputation and his connections in the community to make sure that bullies knew there would be consequences if they hurt innocent people. But the most important thing I learned, Vincent said, looking directly into James's eyes, was that we never use our strength to hurt others. We use it to protect and help. That's what makes us different from bullies. James listened to every word, feeling amazed by his grandfather's stories, but also worried about his own situation. "But Grandpa, I'm not strong like you," James said quietly. "I'm just a kid, and Tommy and his friends are bigger than me. I don't know how to make them stop." Vincent chuckled softly and placed his weathered hand on James's shoulder. "Strength comes in many different forms, my boy. You have something that those bullies don't have. You have a kind heart and a good mind. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is show others how to be better people." Throughout the weekend, Vincent spent time teaching James important lessons about confidence and character. He showed James how to stand up straight with his shoulders back, how to speak clearly without mumbling, and how to look people in the eye when he talked to them. These weren't just physical changes, Vincent explained. They were ways of showing the world that you respected yourself. But more than anything else, Vincent taught James about the difference between being strong and being a bully. "Remember this always, James," Vincent said as they sat together on Sunday evening. "We don't use our strength to hurt others or to make them feel small. We use it to protect people and to help them feel safe. That's what makes us different from bullies. That's what makes us better." Monday morning arrived with a crisp autumn breeze that rustled the golden leaves on the trees surrounding Oakwood Primary School. James Mitchell walked through the familiar iron gates. But something was different about him today. His backpack still hung from his shoulders in the same way, and he wore the same carefully mended school uniform that his mother had washed and pressed the night before. But there was something new in the way he carried himself. James's head was held high instead of looking down at the ground. His shoulders were straight and confident, just like his grandfather Vincent had taught him over the weekend. He still felt butterflies dancing in his stomach, and his heart beat a little faster than usual. But there was a new kind of strength flowing through him like warm honey. During his morning lessons, James found it easier to concentrate on Mrs. Adams's mathematics problems. When she asked the class questions about fractions and decimals, James raised his hand for the first time in weeks. His voice was clear and steady when he gave his answers. And Mrs. Adams smiled with pleasant surprise at seeing her student participating. Again, the other children in his class noticed the change too. Sarah, a quiet girl with red hair who sat 2 desks away from James, gave him a small encouraging smile when he answered a difficult question correctly. Even some of the students who had laughed when Tommy pushed him into the muddy puddle seemed to look at him with new curiosity. When the lunch bell rang across the school, James walked to the cafeteria with measured steps. He unwrapped his simple cheese sandwich and sat at a table near the windows where golden sunlight streamed through the glass, instead of eating quickly and hiding in the library like he usually did. James took his time and looked round the room with calm, observant eyes. That's when he saw something that made his blood run cold but also filled him with a fierce determination he had never felt before. Near the far corner of the cafeteria, Tommy Clark and his two faithful followers, Ben and David, had surrounded a much smaller boy who looked to be only about 10 years old. The little boy had sandy brown hair and wore glasses that were slightly too big for his face. His school uniform was brand new and perfectly clean, suggesting that he was probably another new student at Oakwood Primary. The boy's name was Michael Thompson, though James didn't know this yet. Michael had started at the school just that morning, and his mother had packed him a special lunch with his favorite ham sandwiches and a chocolate biscuit as a treat for his first day. But now Michael's lunch bag was on the floor, and his sandwich had fallen out onto the dirty cafeteria tiles. Tommy was leaning over Michael with a mean grin on his face. "Give us your lunch money." "Little boy," Tommy was saying in a voice that was loud enough for nearby students to hear. "Consider it a tax for being new here. Everyone has to pay it." Michael's eyes were wide with fear behind his glasses, and James could see that the younger boy was very close to tears. Michael's hands were shaking as he clutched his empty lunch bag to his chest like a shield that might protect him from these bigger, meaner boys. "I don't have any money," Michael whispered, his voice so quiet that Tommy had to lean in closer to hear him. "My mom just packed me sandwiches." Ben laughed cruelly and kicked Michael's fallen sandwich further across the floor. "Then maybe you should have brought money instead of this rubbish food." David joined in the harassment, pointing at Michael's new school shoes. "Look at these fancy shoes. Your parents must have money if they can buy you stuff like this. Where is it?" James felt his heart racing like a drum beating fast in his chest. Every instinct told him to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen what was happening, to protect himself by staying silent and invisible. This was exactly the kind of situation that had gotten him into trouble before, if he stood up too. Tommy now. The bullying against James himself would probably get much worse. But then James heard his grandfather's voice echoing in his memory like a gentle but firm guide. Real strength is about standing up for what's right, especially when you're helping people who can't stand up for themselves. James took a deep breath and remembered everything Vincent had taught him over the weekend. He stood up from his table, left his own lunch behind, and walked steadily across the cafeteria toward Tommy and his gang. Other students noticed James moving and began to watch with interest and concern. "Leave him alone." "Tommy," James said clearly, his voice carrying across the room in a way that surprised even himself. Tommy spun round quickly, his eyes wide with shock. He had been so focused on intimidating the new boy that he hadn't noticed James approaching. For a moment, Tommy's mouth hung open as he tried to process what was happening. Well, Tommy finally said, recovering from his surprise and putting his usual mean smirk back on his face. "Look who's found his voice. What are you going to do about it, Romano?" James noticed that Tommy had used his father's Italian surname instead of his mother's English name. Word had clearly spread around the village about Vincent Romano's visit over the weekend, and Tommy was trying to make James feel like an outsider again. But instead of feeling ashamed or embarrassed, James felt proud of his family name and heritage. He stood even straighter and looked Tommy directly in the eyes without flinching. "I'm going to ask you nicely to stop. James replied calmly, his voice steady and controlled. "Michael hasn't done anything to you. He's just trying to eat his lunch." On his first day at a new school, a small crowd of students had gathered round them now, forming a loose circle as they watched this confrontation unfold. James could feel their eyes on him, and he knew that whatever happened next would be remembered by everyone in the school. But instead of feeling nervous about all the attention, he felt strangely calm and focused. "And if I don't stop," Tommy challenged, crossing his arms and trying to look intimidating. James looked him straight in the eye and spoke with quiet confidence. "Then I'll talk to Mrs. Adams. And she'll talk to your parents about what you've been doing. And then I'll talk to my grandfather, who knows a lot of people in this area. People who don't like bullies and who protect children." There was something in James's tone that was different from anything Tommy had heard before. It wasn't angry or threatening, but it was absolutely certain and unshakable. Tommy had expected James to stutter or back down like he always had before. But this was a completely different James standing in front of him. Ben and David shifted uncomfortably beside their leader. They had never seen James stand up to anyone before, and they weren't sure what to do in this new situation. The confidence that had always carried them through their bullying seemed to evaporate in the face of James's calm determination. Tommy looked around at the crowd of students watching them, then back at James's steady gaze, then down at little Michael, who was still clutching his empty lunch bag. For the first time in his life as a bully, Tommy felt uncertain and slightly afraid. "This isn't over," Tommy muttered, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. He jerked his head toward the exit, and Ben and David followed him away from the scene, leaving Michael safe and James victorious. James immediately knelt down next to Michael and began helping him pick up his scattered books and papers. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice full of kindness and concern. Michael nodded and wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "Thank you," he whispered, looking up at James with admiration and gratitude. From that day forward, everything began to change at Oakwood Primary School. James started sitting with children who ate lunch alone, sharing his simple sandwiches and making them feel welcome. He helped classmates who struggled with their homework, and whenever he saw someone being picked on, he stepped in to help just like his grandfather had taught him. 3 months had passed since that important Monday when James first stood up to Tommy Clark in the school cafeteria. The autumn leaves had fallen from the trees, winter had come and gone, and now spring flowers were beginning to bloom in the gardens round Oakwood Primary School. But the biggest changes weren't in the seasons or the weather. The biggest changes were in the hearts and minds of the children who walked through those iron gates every morning. James Mitchell was no longer the lonely, frightened boy who had arrived at the school months earlier. He had grown tall over the winter, and there was a confident light in his brown eyes that hadn't been there before. But more importantly, he was never alone anymore. Round the lunch table where James used to sit by himself, there was now a cheerful group of friends who laughed and shared stories together every day. Michael Thompson, the small boy with glasses whom James had protected from Tommy's bullying, had become one of James's closest friends. Michael was clever and funny, and he loved to tell jokes that made everyone giggle until their stomachs hurt. There was also Emma Clark, a quiet girl with curly red hair who had always been too shy to talk to other children. Emma loved to draw beautiful pictures of flowers and animals, and she had been eating lunch alone for 2 years before James invited her to join their table. Now she smiled more than she ever had before, and her drawings had become so good that Mrs. Adams displayed them on the classroom wall for everyone to admire. The group also included Peter Williams, a boy who walked with a slight limp because of a problem with his leg that he had been born with. Other children had sometimes made fun of Peter's different way of walking, but James's friendship group welcomed him with open arms. Peter turned out to be the best storyteller in the entire school, and he could make even the most ordinary events sound like exciting adventures. There was also Lucy Bennet, a girl whose family had recently moved to the village from Ireland. Lucy had a lovely accent that some children had teased her about, but James's group thought her voice was beautiful and interesting. Lucy taught them Irish songs and told them stories about the green hills and ancient castles of her homeland. Together, this group of friends had created something wonderful at Oakwood Primary School. They looked out for each other like a family, and they always made sure to invite any lonely child to join them. Their table in the cafeteria had become known as the place where everyone was welcome, no matter what they looked like or where they came from. Tommy Clark and his followers, Ben and David, still attended the school, but everything about them had changed dramatically. Without other children supporting them in behavior, and without the power that came from making others afraid, the three boys had been forced to face the truth about what they had been doing. Tommy's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Clark, had been called to the school for several serious meetings with the headmaster and Mrs. Adams. They were shocked and ashamed when they learned about their son's bullying behavior. At home, Tommy's parents had been arguing a lot about money problems and work stress, and Tommy had been taking out his angry feelings on other children at school. As part of his punishment, Tommy was required to attend special counseling sessions with Mrs. Adams twice a week. During these sessions, he learned about empathy and kindness. He practiced thinking about how other people felt when they were hurt or scared. Slowly, very slowly, Tommy began to understand how much pain he had caused to James and other children. Ben and David also had to face consequences for their actions. Their parents were disappointed in them, and they had to write letters of apology to every child they had ever bullied. They also had to do extra work around the school, cleaning classrooms and helping younger students with their reading. One sunny afternoon in March, during the spring break time, when children played outside in the schoolyard, Tommy approached James near the climbing frame where James was laughing with his friends. James felt his muscles tense up automatically when he saw Tommy coming toward him, even though Tommy hadn't bothered him in months. "James," Tommy said quietly, his voice very different from the loud, mean tone he used to use. He was looking down at the ground instead of staring aggressively like he used to do. "I wanted to say something to you." James's friends stopped talking and gathered protectively round him, but James held up his hand to show them that everything was okay. "I wanted to say that I'm sorry," Tommy continued, his words coming out slowly and carefully, "for everything I did to you, for pushing you, for calling you names, for making you feel like you didn't belong here. I was angry about things happening at home with my parents, but that's no excuse for how I treated you and other kids." James looked carefully at Tommy's face and could see that something had genuinely changed. Tommy's eyes looked sad and ashamed, but also hopeful. There was no trace of the cruel smirk or the mean attitude that used to define him. "Thank you for saying that, Tommy," James replied thoughtfully. "It takes real courage to apologize, especially in front of other people." Tommy looked up from the ground and met James's eyes for the first time in months. Maybe we could start over. I know I don't deserve it, but I'd like to try to be a better person." James thought about his grandfather's lessons about forgiveness and second chances. He remembered Vincent telling him that everyone deserves the opportunity to change and grow. James extended his hand toward Tommy in the same firm, confident way that his grandfather had taught him. "I'd like that too, Tommy." The two boys shook hands, and James's friends watched with amazement and respect. They had learned from James that true strength sometimes meant giving people the chance to become better. The following week, something extraordinary happened. James was asked to speak at the special school assembly that was held every month for students, teachers, and parents. Mrs. Adams had suggested that James share his story about friendship and kindness with the entire school community. Standing at the wooden podium in the school hall, James looked out at all the faces staring back at him. There were students from every grade level, from tiny 5-year-olds to teenagers who were almost ready to leave primary school. There were teachers he knew and some he had never spoken to. And there were parents and grandparents who had come to hear the presentations. In the front row, James could see his mother Helen wearing her best dress and smiling at him with tears of pride in her eyes. Next to her sat Vincent Romano, who had driven down from Manchester especially for this important day. His grandfather gave him an encouraging nod and a small wave. "When I first came to Oakwood Primary School," James began, his voice clear and strong enough for everyone in the hall to hear, "I felt like I didn't belong here. I was different from many of the other children, and some people made me feel bad about that difference." He paused and looked round the room, seeing nods of understanding from both children and adults who had experienced similar feelings. "But I learned something very important from my grandfather," James continued. "Being different isn't something to hide or be ashamed of. Being different is something that makes us special and helps us understand other people who might also feel different." James talked about the importance of choosing kindness over cruelty, friendship over loneliness, and love over hate. He explained how much better the school had become when everyone started looking out for each other instead of trying to hurt each other. "We all have the power to make our school a place where everyone belongs," James concluded. "When we stand together and take care of each other, we create something beautiful that makes everyone stronger and happier." The applause that filled the school hall was warm and genuine, lasting for almost a full minute. Children clapped enthusiastically. Teachers wiped tears from their eyes, and parents whispered to each other about what a remarkable young man James had become. After the assembly, Vincent walked over to his grandson and put his strong arm round James's shoulders. "I'm proud of you, James," Vincent said with a voice full of love and admiration. "You've learned the most important lesson of all. True strength comes from lifting other people up, not from putting them down." James smiled and felt a warm glow of happiness spread through his entire body. He had discovered that his mixed heritage wasn't something that divided him from other people. Instead, it was something that helped him understand and connect with all kinds of people who might feel different or left out. As the school year came to an end, Oakwood Primary had become famous throughout the entire village as a place of kindness and acceptance. Parents from other areas began asking if their children could attend the school because they had heard about the wonderful community that the students had created together. James had not only found his own inner strength and confidence, but he had helped create a place where every child could feel safe, valued, and loved. The greatest victories in life, he had learned, weren't won through force or fear or violence. They were won through courage, compassion, and the simple but powerful act of treating every person with dignity and respect. The end.